There are some aspects of media that we all consume, whether it's television, web videos, literature, and movies. We all have been consuming anything that interests us as long as it interests us. And when we watch something for a while, we will start to realize that we pay attention to quality and whether if they are good or not. Sometimes it happens immediately, sometimes it happens when we look at the rear view mirror. And that's when we start to see things more closely and notice the cracks in its foundation. This is a trope called seasonal rot. Things that are built up one way are suddenly swerved. Motivations don't add up. Character development is down. Plot lines are repeated. It gets way too wacky for its own good, or it just goes on for way too long. Yes, this trope even applies to music. A lot of bands who have made it big have their peaks and valleys. There is no such thing as a perfect career. A lot of these people have had dips in quality at some point. Some have gotten out of this trope, and others have not been the same since. But one musician's career has arguably gone either way. Eminem is one of the most popular rappers, if not musicians, of all time. He was controversial and angry and funny, but he was also serious and insightful and three-dimensional. Between the years 1999 to 2002, he was on top of the world. For those of you who weren't in the know of how big he was, think Harry Styles at the end of the 2010s. Sorry, I don't listen to much popular music that comes out these days, but that is how big he was in the early 2000s, especially in 2002 when he arguably peaked. Then, 2 years later, Eminem released Encore, and it disappeared from my point of view. No one talked about it. I didn't see any reviews about it. In fact, I stopped being interested in Eminem due to veering off from hip hop to rock. And there was a very, very, very long period of time when I didn't even hear from Eminem, despite the fact that he had been making music through the years. I was ready to move on from him until I saw a video that talked about the worst Eminem songs he's ever done. And most of these songs were from Encore. Then I realized that I never saw the reviews for this album many years later, and saw that it was one of his weaker albums, and I wondered why. Then the video gave reasons why, and gave examples from the song, and I was fascinated. I knew why it's one of his weaker albums, and I ended up buying the album, now knowing the reputation that preceded it, and listened to it a dozen times. This trope is called biofascination. But let's look at why it's one of his weaker albums. If you look at his past few albums, all of them have a particular focus. The Marshall Mathers LP focused on being a horrorcore album that talked about his family relationships, whether it talks about his mom, his wife, or his effect on American culture. The Eminem Show focused on how fame has affected his life, as well as its influence on young people, his mother, and his misunderstanding of rap and how his music can help people in their lives. When it comes to Encore, however, it is all over the place. In hindsight, the problem began with its very first single, Just Lose It. Like with the past few albums, their first singles were lighthearted, irrelevant, comical songs that stand out since Eminem albums, while known to have humor, are nothing like their first singles, and whatever humor there are in those albums are usually a lot more dark and, dare I say, nightmarish. When I first heard Just Lose It, I didn't think anything more than a song that I listened to over and over again. But now everyone said that this song was the start of where Eminem's career began going in a downturn. Although I'd argue it happened a few months earlier with the D12 song My Band. The beats, the humor, the accents, and this D12 song stands out because Eminem has the entire first verse by himself, and arguably, this is where Eminem was headed off in his next album. Eminem can be silly and dumb, but he always takes his craft seriously, with energy and clever wordplay. Encore is, well, I'll compare this album to season 4 of Community. Both built up an entire audience with their clever storytelling, nice sense of humor, earned dramatic moments, and a sense that there was an ongoing growth with each passing year. However, when these were released, something seemed off. The familiarities were there, everything seemed in the right place to a certain degree. However, as time went on, the flaws became more apparent. The products just seemed like a shadow of their former selves. Jokes had no dimensions, no growth, no character. They weren't necessarily broken, but they were missing focus, missing what made them good in the first place. This was the album where his drug abuse started to take its toll, which would not have been a problem for the album itself had it not been for the fact that 4 songs leaked and Eminem had to rush and scramble to create new ones. The combination of the two factors does explain most of the second part of the album, where it's kind of like if Just Lose It was rushed and uninspired. Encore has the reverse Hancock problem, where on this album the serious stuff makes up for the first part, where the second part is filled with lighthearted material, which shows the Slim Shady persona stretched to the nth degree. The Slim Shady character was supposed to be an alter ego of Eminem that had a darkly comedic edge. He was used as a palate cleanser after the serious storytellings of Marshall Mathers. The problem with Slim Shady is that on this album is that, well, you know when I said that the products seemed like a shadow of their former selves? This is a trope called flanderization, where a trait or action of a character becomes more and more overblown, until they become a cartoon character and they are only known for that one thing. This mostly happens due to the fact that the character has as much character development as it can go, so it has no choice but to de-evolve most of the time. This has happened to Slim Shady. The fact that this ego has taken up most of this album makes him overexposed. Slim's darker comedic edge is replaced by immature grade school jokes that get run into the ground. There is much more emphasis on toilet humor. The wordplay was dumbed down, and the shock value is just trying to be shocking for the sake of it. The reason why the previous Eminem albums were so good were because there was some sort of balance. Sure, they had humor, dark and light, but he was never afraid to shine a light on how fame has affected his life. And despite having these familiar topics he hits on these albums, you still get a sense of growth. Between the Marshall Mathers LP and the Eminem Show, he's become less angry and more introspective. It's because Marshall shows that he has a conscience. He's a human being under that controversy. And after all that development in terms of music, writing, and character, what's next? Where does one go after a critically acclaimed bestseller? This album is a very uneven product, but despite the flaws in this album, I find it a very fascinating product. This album is an interesting failure because it comes from an amazing mind that had begun to burn out after being on an amazing high. After coming off a pretty good album, a good major starring motion picture, and memorable soundtrack, with constant promotion, concerts, working, promotions, working, pro-concerts, drug abuse, working, promotions, and on top of all that, he had the pressures of creating an album that would be as good, if not better, than the Eminem Show. This is a fascinating album because it shows how much pressure can be done to a person, what can be done with only a certain amount of time. It's a fascinating record because there are some good things about this album. It goes to show that, despite it being conceived as a failure, we can remember the good parts. It goes to show that there is room to fall, room to breathe, and regroup, and figure out what works and what doesn't, and keep going. We can be different people when we come out of that dark period. We can all grow and mature. We can all fail, and yet we can all learn.